Kristen Keith joined with Steve Berkowitz of USA Today. He just wrapped up the forum. The panel was entitled, "Where does the money go?" So Steve, I gotta ask you first, where does the money go?
Well, it goes all over the place within college athletics, to support non-revenue sports, but unquestionably a large amount of the money is going into football and into men's basketball, and on a lot of levels, a greater and greater percentage of it is going there. In a right and fair world where everything was even, you could distribute it equally across all sports, and it would be great to do it that way, but the reality of it doesn't lend itself to that. The salaries in football and men's basketball and women's basketball are different than they are in other sports, and the financial requirements to put 85 guys on the field in football are different. So, I mean, that's sort of the reality of the situation.
Do you think that student athletes should be paid or should they be compensated?
That's a very nuanced question as to what constitutes pay and what constitutes compensation and how you define play for pay. Whether or not a scholarship that is comprised solely of room, board, books, tuition, and fees as it is now, whether or not that's sufficient compensation, hard to know, but it certainly seems that's going to be enhanced for covering the cost of attendance. So at least athletes are athletes are not having to pay in order to go to school, to deal with their own incidental expenses and things like that. Going beyond that becomes a much more complicated proposition, and is even complicated for a judge who presided over a 5-year legal case to be able to sort it out. So it's a very, very difficult question to deal with.
Speaking of legal cases, you talk about the OBannon case. How do you think it works for an athlete to be compensated on their likeness and image? How is the university supposed to tackle that?
They're going to get guidance from the courts. That's the short answer to the question. I mean, that's what's going to happen. I mean, I think this is going to be dealt with legally. I mean, ultimately, judges are going to say either this is allowed or this isn't allowed, and I think it's sort of the ball has been taken out of the hands of the schools at this point.
If they are going to be compensated for the likeness and image, is it the same across the board? Is it the same for a football player that it is for a basketball player, that it is for a swimmer? How do you see it working?
There are certainly different cases in different sports. There are certainly people who are in non-revenue sports in certain schools who have really high profiles and who have a lot of value. Do they have as much value as an equivalently star player in football or men's basketball? No. I mean, they're just not as well known or as marketable. How you measure that and how you deal with that in terms of compensating athletes, I think, again, it's one of these nuanced, difficult situations that you deal with.
What do you think was the most pressing issue that was brought up on the panel today?
I think it has to do with the nature of whether or not athletics are going to continue to be sort of broad-based in terms of the sport offerings. And I think there's a lot of fear, and for a lot of reasons, about that. The reality is that athletics programs are going to shrink as the costs go up, and schools are not going to back off the amounts of money that they put into football and men's basketball. That's just not going to happen. And the result of that is going to be potentially the elimination of teams, or the reductions in fundings of teams, or perhaps an entirely different model. It's going to be an interesting thing to see how schools do, or whether or not they're willing to simply do away with athletic programs.
If you could solve one issue right now and said that's the most prominent issue that needs to be solved in college athletics, what would it be?
I think that whole notion of broad-based offerings in college athletics is a pretty fundamental thing. I mean, that's sort of the nature of what you're doing with a college athletics program, is sort of to be there for the students. What it ought to be about is being sort of part of that college environment, as opposed to it being sort of this separate professional enterprise.
Great. Steve Berkowitz, USA Today. Thank you so much for joining us, Steve, and thank you so much for watching the Big 12 Digital Network.